Year 1300. You are sick, very sick, and you are taken to the only place people call a hospital. Sounds humane, right? But wait. Here the nurses do not hand out medicine, they offer prayers. The doctors do not ask how high your fever is. They ask whether you have confessed your sins. And your only chance to leave this place is as ashes. This is not just a story about medieval medicine. It is a story about faith, ignorance, and kindness that could kill. A world where people truly believed that prayer alone was strong enough to defeat the plague. In reality, it was not. It only helped the plague win faster. Before we dive into this world filled with blood, incense, and despair, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because here we do not just learn about history, we survive it. And I want to know where you are listening from. Leave a comment below, so I can see how many brave souls are joining me on this journey into the place everyone feared, the medieval hospital, where you came to die, ever so politely. Congratulations, you just woke up. In a hospital in the year 1300, congratulations. You are still breathing, for now. You open your eyes and realize you are lying in a hospital, but not the kind with white beds, kind nurses, and bright fluorescent lights. No, this is the year 1300. Here the only light comes from a dying candle, and the only scent you breathe in is a mix of blood, extinguished wax, and the rotting smell of hope. You do not remember what happened. Maybe it was a fever, a wound, or just a sneeze at the wrong time of year. But guess what? Here every reason for being admitted leads to the same result. You will leave this place as ashes. Around you, a choir of moans performs in perfect misery. Some wheeze like broken bellows, others whisper prayers in Latin that no one really understands. And in the farthest corner, a monk is writing something in a book. Perhaps it is your name. Perhaps it is the death register. Who can tell? A medieval hospital was never designed to make you better. It was designed to make sure you die properly. Here, no one says, "Get well soon." They say, "May your soul find peace quickly." Instead of painkillers, you receive a prayer. Instead of doctors, you have priests. And instead of a healthcare system, you have God, who is quite busy dealing with the backlog of thousands of other souls. The blanket covering you is made from reused burlap, stained with dried blood, and it smells as if someone died under it, which might actually be true. On the ceiling, cobwebs draw a map of heaven for anyone bored enough to look up. And every time the wind whistles through the cracks in the door, you hear hymns echoing from the chapel next door. It is not a lullaby. It is the soundtrack to your upcoming funeral. Hospital sounds familiar, does it not? But in the 14th century, that word did not mean a place for healing. It came from the Latin word hospes, meaning a place to welcome travelers, the poor, and the dying. Yes, you are not a patient. You are a guest about to leave this world cared for with kindness, scented candles, and a one-way ticket to heaven. You look around for a nurse. A woman in a brown robe wearing a cross walks by with a bowl of water and a wooden spoon. For a moment, hope flickers in your mind. Medicine, no. She scoops some water, dips her fingers in it, and draws a cross on your forehead. May God heal you. Touching, really, except for the fact that you still have a fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 40 degrees Celsius, and your skin is blistering like bread in an oven. If you are wondering, so where is the doctor? The answer is simple: there is none. Physician was a luxury reserved for the nobility. They did not come to hospitals. They had private monks to tend to them. And hospitals, they were for commoners, the poor, the homeless, and the dying. Healing the body was not the goal, preparing the soul was. And if you think religion merely influenced medicine, you are deeply mistaken. The hospital was part of the church itself. Your bed is about 10 feet or roughly 3 meters away from the altar. Monks walk among the sick chanting prayers, as if distributing rations for souls. Every morning, instead of having your blood pressure checked, your sins are examined. And if you cough too loudly, no one hands you medicine, they hand you a crucifix, just in case. The bell rings. Everyone tries to kneel, even those who are barely alive. And you, even with a broken leg, must join in, because in a medieval hospital, faith outweighs the condition of your heart and lungs. You notice a man lying beside you, trembling. He whispers, "Father told me not to be afraid. Death is only the first step toward healing." Then he coughs up blood. You begin to think, well, I suppose he really is about to be healed. But wait, why was it like this? Why did an entire healthcare system treat death as if it were an administrative procedure? The answer lies in how people of the Middle Ages understood illness. They believed disease was a punishment from God. If you were wounded, plagued, or sick, it was not because of bacteria, but because your soul had sinned. The hospital's mission was to reconcile you with God, not with your immune system. In other words, this place was not trying to save you, it was trying to help you die righteously. Look around. Each bed has a candle, a crucifix, and a small basin to hold whatever might remain of you. The air is thick with the smell of wine, sweat, and holy oil. Outside, crows perch on the roof, patiently waiting for their next shift. You hear footsteps. A priest approaches your bed holding a Bible. He looks at you, smiles gently, and asks, "My child, are you ready?" You almost ask, ready for what, but then realize you do not want to know the answer. In the corner of the room, another patient has just stopped breathing. No one panics. There is no shout for a doctor, only the sound of the chapel bell. A nun quietly pulls the blanket over his face. No one cries. No one is surprised. Because here, death is not an event, it is a schedule. A chill runs down your spine. Not because of fever, but because you finally realize that this entire hospital operates not to save lives, but to guide souls toward the proper entrance to heaven. And if you dare to glance at the priest's ledger, you will see a list of patient names. In the column marked status, there are only two options: alive or redeemed. The candle beside your bed flickers. The murmurs of prayer rise higher. You suddenly think, if this place is meant to save souls, then your soul had better start running. But not yet. The real question is, who built this kind of hospital? Who decided that saving souls mattered more than saving bodies? And why for centuries did people still believe that prayer was the best antibiotic? You want to understand, do you not good? Because in the next part, we will step through the chapel doors, where every medieval hospital was in truth just a branch office of heaven. And in that world, God was the physician and you were merely the experiment. The monastic orders and the church, the managers and the intercessors. You think hospitals were run by doctors? That is adorable. In the year 1300, a doctor was a luxury as rare as finding Wi-Fi in a cemetery. The people running medieval hospitals did not wear white coats. They wore black robes, carried Bibles, and spoke with God far more often than they spoke with patients. Yes, welcome to a healthcare system personally sponsored by heaven. Before the term medical center existed, Europe had hospitalium, meaning a place to welcome pilgrims, the poor, the dying, and souls in need of salvation. And who had the compassion, patience, and most importantly, the free labor to run such places? The church. Because in a world where everything belonged to God, from land and life to the common cold healing, was a religious act. And the church took that very seriously. Monasteries became the first centers of what we might call health care, though make no mistake, they did not care for your health. They cared for your faith. In the records of St. John's Hospital in Bruges, Belgium, The sick were described as guests of God, not patients. Each person was greeted with a candle, a crucifix, and a prayer. It sounds touching, until you realize that most of them died within a week. Here, everything revolved around the soul. Priests and nuns believed that illness was a test of faith. God made you ill, not because he hated you, but because he wanted to teach you humility. And if you died in faith, congratulations, you had won, at least theologically speaking. From the 12th century onward, many religious orders, the Benedictines, the Augustinians, and especially the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of the Hospital, began expanding their charitable system. The name sounds grand, does it not? But these knights were not galloping off to rescue patients. They were riding on faith. This order founded numerous hospitals across Europe and the Mediterranean places, where instead of doctors, you would find armored knights praying at the bedside, then drawing the sign of the cross before picking up a shovel to bury you afterward. The most fascinating and slightly terrifying part was that hospitals and cemeteries were often only a few yards apart. On one side, saving souls. On the other, receiving souls. So if you ever heard the chapel bell ring, do not rejoice. It was not the signal of recovery, but the announcement that another case had just completed the process. Inside the hospital, patients were arranged according to their spiritual status. The closer your bed was to the altar, the more VIP your soul was. Want a higher floor in heaven? Try to get a bed near the statue of the Virgin Mary. As for those tucked away in the farthest corner, good luck. There the air was cold, the flies were plenty, and if you died, no one might notice until the next morning. But to be fair, the monks were not heartless. They truly believed they were helping you. In a world that had never heard of bacteria, they believed that healing the soul meant healing the body. Every morning, nuns sprinkled holy water on the beds, lit candles, and recited the Anima Christi, and medicine occasionally, a bit of herbs, some bloodletting, and a reminder, do not sin again. This was an age when prayer and medicine became one, and that was not a metaphor. It was literally the procedure. Have a fever, they anointed you with holy oil. Stomach pain. You were given holy wine. Unconscious. Then came the priest, the permanent form of treatment. Hospitals were not just places for the sick, they were inns for souls. Patients did not pay with gold, but with faith. Sometimes they donated their property to the church in exchange for care, a polite way of saying, I will leave my house to God as long as he lets me die peacefully. Thanks to this, the monastic orders grew wealthier, their lands expanded, but the hospitals still one bed, 10 patients, and 2 candles. If someone miraculously survived and left the hospital alive, it was not considered the result of medicine, it was a miracle. A record from the Hôtel Dieu in Paris in the 14th century describes one patient who recovered after confessing 3 times and stopping his profanity. In short, abandon medicine, keep God. And what about doctors? Oh, they existed, but outside the hospital walls. Doctors were educated men from universities, literate, learned, and generally unwilling to deal with the poor. They served nobles, merchants, and sometimes even kings. Monastic hospitals, too dirty, too holy, and far too hopeless. In other words, doctors of that era did not treat the living, they studied the dead. This divide created the great tragedy of medieval medicine. Those who had knowledge never met those who needed saving, and those who truly cared had no idea what medicine was. To be fair, you cannot really blame them. Since the 13th century, the church had forbidden monks to shed human blood. That meant no surgery, no dissection, no cutting of any kind. Doctors were bound by religious law, while barber surgeons, yes, the local barbers with too much free time were allowed to cut, slice, stab, and bleed people. So if you were lying in a hospital bed and needed emergency surgery, do not expect an angel in white to walk in. Expect a bearded man with a razor in hand, asking, "Would you like a shave while I am at it?" All of this was perfectly legal under church authority. To them, hospitals were acts of charity. Every soul saved by a monk earned spiritual credit. Every patient who died in grace added points to the church's divine scoreboard. If heaven had leaderboards, the monastic orders would be top-tier players. And you, the unfortunate patient, were simply their chance to grind experience. But do not laugh. In a world where everything revolved around religion, faith was the only technology they had. There were no microscopes, no antibiotics, no concept of sterility. Only scripture and kindness. And sometimes that kindness killed faster than the disease itself. If you were lying on a hospital bed in the year 1300, you had to understand one thing: God was the chief physician. Every priest was a medical assistant, and the hospital was merely the waiting room to heaven. Each evening when the bells rang, the nuns would walk the halls with candles in their hands. They did not check pulses, they checked souls. One patient whispered, "Why am I still not better?" The nun smiled gently, because God does not wish it yet. That was not comfort. That was diagnosis. And so for centuries, the church held full authority over life and death. From the moment you entered the hospital, a priest would record your name. When you died, he would add one final line: returned to God. No medical records, no statistics, only the journal of faith. You lie there hearing the chapel bell echo through the stone walls, and you wonder if my soul is being cared for, who is taking care of my body. The answer lies in the next part, where we will step into the real treatment room of the Middle Ages, a place where the air smells not of incense and holiness, but of rotting flesh, pus, and dying hope. Eat, sleep, and breathe. Bacteria. You open your eyes again. The sun has risen, but in this cramped stone room, no one really knows what morning means. Here, there are no such things as day or night, only 2 moments in time before someone dies, and after someone dies. Welcome to the inpatient ward of a medieval hospital, where beds are not assigned to individuals, but to clusters of people. 1 bed for 2, sometimes 3. Not because they are friends, but because there are too few beds and far too many diseases. If you are lucky, your bedmate merely has a fever. If not, he might be in his final stage. The air is thick, so heavy it feels like it could be cut into blocks and sold at the market. You take a breath and immediately regret it. The stench of decaying flesh, rancid herbs, melted candle wax, and that sickly sweet tang of dried blood blend together into a symphony of rot. If there were ever a nose chosen to test the limits of hell, it would be yours right now. A nun walks by carrying a bucket of water. You hope it is clean. Wrong. It is the rinse water from previous patients, reused, of course, because here clean water is a philosophical concept, not a physical one. On the walls, a few small windows are opened for ventilation, but instead of fresh air, they bring in the breeze from the cemetery next door. Yes, the cemetery. In the Middle Ages, hospitals and graveyards were often so close that you could hear the sound of shovels digging on the other side of the wall. It was not always clear which side belonged to which institution. The room you are in, called a ward, was designed to welcome the light of God. But apparently God was busy, because the only light you receive comes from a few dying candles. On the bedside table sits a bowl of thin porridge, or to be precise, an ancient pottage reheated over and over for the past week. People believed that eating something warm preserved the breath of life. No one mentioned bacteria, because the word bacteria would not exist for another 500 years. So if you died of food poisoning, rest assured, they would say it was the will of God. A man lies beside you, his skin pale as chalk, his throat rattling with every breath. A nun leans over, placing her hand on his forehead. "The Lord is purifying his soul," she whispers. "Purifying how with a fever of 102 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 39 degrees Celsius, and a complete lack of drinking water." You sit up and look around. On the muddy floor are stains of everything imaginable: urine, holy wine, blood, and something you would rather not identify. No one cleans it. No one has time. They simply sprinkle ashes or herbs over it to drive away evil spirits. It is no wonder that evil air was the most popular medical concept of the time. According to the people of the Middle Ages, disease spread through poisonous air, miasma, the bad vapor that rose from corpses, garbage, and sin itself. The cure: burn incense, fumigate herbs, and pray. If you were dying of infection, you would be blessed with fragrant smoke and a Latin hymn. Your bed, a creaking wooden plank covered with straw, used to belong to someone else. And by used to, that means yesterday. There were no fresh sheets, no disinfection. They simply added another layer of straw. If you dared lift that layer, you would discover an entire civilization of microorganisms throwing a feast in your honor. A 14th century patient did not need to imagine bacteria, they lived with them. You scratch your neck. A flea crawls into your collar. You glance around, everyone is scratching. Fleas were the most loyal companions of every soul in the hospital. And while you are still breathing, they are already preparing a buffet called you. It was no coincidence that from places like these, the Black Death began to spread across Europe. The sick lay beside the healthy rats, scurried under the beds, and fleas bit everyone. Thus, hospitals became the first distribution centers for epidemics in human history. If you still doubt it, take a look at the floor plan of the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, the largest hospital in 14th century Europe. It held up to 700 patients at once. A single massive room, beds packed tightly together with no walls and no ventilation. People slept, coughed, breathed, prayed, and died together. At times, nurses could not even tell who was still alive and who had already passed. The solution was simple: if you did not respond when the prayers were read, they concluded your soul had been saved. The caregivers, mostly nuns, worked themselves to exhaustion. They washed cloth, changed bandages, and carried away corpses. But washing here meant dip it in the river and hang it to dry, not make it clean. They believed river water was a blessing from God. No one noticed that upstream there was a drainage pipe from another hospital's latrine. So yes, you were drinking the hand-washing water of someone who had been buried that very morning. Some monks began to have doubts. Records tell of a priest in England who once remarked, "The foul smell makes the sick weaker." Congratulations, he had just discovered the concept of hygiene and died of infection shortly afterward. During meals, everyone sat around a long wooden table, sharing bowls and spoons. One patient coughed into his porridge, then passed it to the next. No one reacted. Charity, they said. Charity and contagion. Outside in the kitchen, a huge pot of herbs boiled, pungent, smoky, and choking. It was the fumigation medicine meant to purify the air. In reality, it made patients cough harder, their eyes burn, and their lungs collapse twice as fast. But the monks believed it drove the demon of sickness away. In a way, they were right. The demon left because the patient died. At night, the hospital became a live-action horror story. Moans echoed through the halls, prayers blended with the chirping of insects. Candles dimmed and shadows moved slowly down the corridors. They were not ghosts. They were nuns carrying away the dead. Graceful, patient, efficient, because they had done it hundreds of times before. In the darkness, you realize here death is just part of the daily routine. You try to sleep, but the fever blurs your thoughts. In your dream, you see souls rising from their beds, silently walking out the door, lining up as St. Peter calls the roll. Then you jolt awake, a rat has just scurried across your chest. Next to you, your bedmate is silent. A nun approaches, lays her hand on his forehead. "He has been saved," she says. Then she turns to you. "Sleep, my child. God is watching." You glance around the death-scented room and think, if God really is watching, could he maybe open a window? And that was the great paradox of the medieval hospital. A place meant for healing became a silent weapon of mass death. No one meant harm, they simply did not know. They did not know that fleas carried disease. They did not know that bacteria needed clean water. They did not know that a single breath could kill another person. They believed in God, in fragrance, in prayer, but not in soap. If you survived a week here, you did not need a doctor. You deserved a medal. But do not celebrate yet, because you are about to be treated in the most literal sense. Yes, the medieval doctor has arrived. Not with a stethoscope, but with a bloodletting knife, a set of suction cups, and an astrology chart, to see whether Saturn approves of saving you today. The doctors of magic, bloodletting, cupping, and astrology. You imagine a doctor walking into a patient's room, white coat, stethoscope around his neck, calm voice asking, "How are we feeling today?" Now fast forward to the year 1300, the door creaks open, and the person who enters looks like a wizard recently expelled from Hogwarts. A long robe, a pointed hat, a knife in one hand, an astrology book in the other, and a jar full of live leeches. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, where science and magic share a bottle of wine, and both die of infection. The doctor bends over your bed and slowly opens his notebook made of sheepskin. Not a medical record, a star chart. Yes, before checking your pulse, he checks the position of Jupiter. If Saturn happens to be sitting in the wrong place, he concludes that you are sick due to celestial disagreement. And no, this is not a joke. Medieval medicine officially relied on astrology. They believed the human body was a miniature version of the cosmos. When the planets were angry, your organs suffered. If you were vomiting, blame Venus. If you were dying, Saturn probably just yawned. To heal you, the doctor needed to restore the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It sounds like the four elements in a fantasy role-playing game, but here it was actual medical science. They believed every illness came from an imbalance of these fluids. Too much blood, drain it. Too much black bile, give a laxative. Too much phlegm, clear the nose. Too much of all four, sorry, God is calling. Open a vein, the doctor commands. Two nuns hold your arm. You panic. For what? To release the bad air, he replies, drawing out a rusty razor. Your blood begins to flow into a bronze bowl. They call it phlebotomy, the therapy of bloodletting. The goal: bring the body back into harmony. The result: you lose about 1 pint of blood, feel dizzy, and your soul temporarily gets a preview of heaven. They believed blood carried illness, so the more you drained, the purer you became. Some people were bled weekly. Certain nobles were so wealthy, they even owned personal bloodletting machines at home. Yes, self-torture, but make it luxury. And if you were poor, a monk would gladly do it for you, free of charge, without anesthesia, and with absolutely no warranty. If you are still alive, congratulations. Now comes the cupping therapy. A servant places a glass cup on your skin, lights a small flame inside, and then seals it against your body. Not to detox like in a modern spa, but to draw out evil air. The problem is, the evil air does not go anywhere, only your skin burns. Afterward, they apply a powder of ashes mixed with honey to the blister. You ask, is this medicine? The servant smiles. No, this is faith. And faith here is truly powerful. so powerful that if you die during treatment, no one blames the doctor. They simply say, God chose the moment, a polite way of saying he bled to death, but at least his soul is clean. The doctor wipes his hands on his robe, then pours a thick gray mixture into your bowl. You ask, "What is this?" He answers, "The elixir of balance." Ingredients: a touch of ox bile, a bit of powdered bone, holy oil, and if you are wealthy, a few drops of mercury. Yes, mercury, the same metal that can make you glow in the dark and kill you in a few days. Why did they use it? Because according to the four humors theory, mercury was considered a cooling substance meant to calm souls that were too hot. In other words, if you had a fever, they gave you poison. If you survived, it was a miracle. If you died, it was purification. Either way, they won. Once the bloodletting was done, the skin blistered, and the elixir consumed, the doctor sat down by your bed and unrolled another parchment, an astrological chart. He checked which planets were currently ruling the house of illness. If Mars was strong, he advised more prayer. If Jupiter was weak, he suggested fasting. If Venus was in retrograde, sorry, you were going to die that week. Not the doctor's fault, the universe's. Meanwhile, the priest stood beside him, observing the treatment. If the patient groaned in pain, he made the sign of the cross. If the patient stopped breathing, he began the Ave Maria. It was a perfect choreography between medicine and funeral ritual. When someone was dying, they did not call the doctor, they called the priest. Because in the medieval mind, death was not a failure of medicine, but the ultimate triumph of faith. You were not cured. You were redeemed. This system endured for centuries. Medieval universities like Salerno in Italy and Montpellier in France taught the four humors, astrology, and theological medicine. Their textbooks declared, "The human body operates according to the will of God. The physician is merely his assistant." A poetic justification for the simple truth they had no idea what they were doing. Sometimes a few doctors actually observed their patients, wrote down symptoms, and even questioned the old theories. But those people were often labeled as arrogant or worse, as heretics. Questioning God was a sin, so most physicians chose the safer path, blame the stars, and draw a little more blood. If you ask, was there no opposition? Yes, there was from a few. Some folk healers, old women who knew herbs, brewed teas, made poultices, and treated wounds, occasionally helped patients truly recover. But they were accused of witchcraft. Because clearly women could not heal without magic. The result, they were burned at the stake, and their patients soon followed. A perfect cycle of progress. Through modern eyes, you might see medieval doctors as cruel. But in truth, they were simply products of their time and age when faith was science and science was sin. They genuinely believed that bleeding restored balance, that prayer cleansed the soul, that Saturn ruled your liver. And so each time a patient died, they did not feel guilt, they felt that the will of God had been fulfilled. You lie there watching the doctor pack his tools, the blood-stained knife, the jar of writhing leeches, the star chart. He folds his hands and says softly, "I have done all I can. The rest is up to God." Then he leaves you weak, pale, and half-drained, but at least balanced. Half your blood gone, but balanced. Outside the chapel, bell tolls. A nun approaches and sprinkles holy water over you. "The Lord has healed your soul," she says. As for your body, no one mentions it. In a brief moment of clarity, you realize in this place, dying pure matters more than living unclean. They are not heartless, they truly believe this, and that is what makes it terrifying. You stare at the ceiling, swallow your fear, and whisper to yourself, maybe tomorrow will be better. But then you remember tomorrow they will come again. With the knife, the leeches, and the prayers. And so medieval medicine endured not through knowledge, but through faith. faith that every cut was a prayer, every drop of blood a step closer to heaven. And if you were still alive after treatment, believe me, it was not because the doctor was skilled. It was because God was busy somewhere else. When prayer was the main prescription. You wake up after a long night, your head pounding as if all your blood had been drained, because in fact it had. Light filters through the crack in the door, and the chapel bell rings like a pre-programmed death reminder. Here every morning begins with that sound, not to wake you up, but to remind you that you are still not dead. The air is cold, heavy, and thick with the smell of wax, sweat, ashes, and faith. Before you can gather your thoughts, a gentle voice whispers beside you, "Good morning, my child. It is time for morning prayer." Not a doctor, not a nurse, a nun. In a medieval hospital, they were the soul of the healthcare system. There were no medicines, no ventilators, no experimental science, only them and God. You look around the ward. 7 beds, 12 people, all murmuring the Ave Maria in hoarse, trembling voices. A man coughs up blood. 2 nuns rush to his side, not with bandages or water, but with a crucifix and a prayer. One of them whispers softly, "Lord, please receive this soul in peace. He is not dead yet, but clearly they are getting ready." Here, every patient is treated as someone already dying. There is no recovery ward, only a waiting room for salvation. Instead of doctors prescribing medicine, priests prescribe coordinates to heaven. Instead of painkillers, you receive prayers to ease your sins. Instead of IV fluids, you are anointed with holy oil. Everything is designed for one purpose, to prepare you for a proper death. The morning ceremony begins. A priest chants his Latin, echoing through the room like waves rising from a tomb. Each patient is given a candle, not to light the way back to health, but to guide them to the afterlife. A nun walks around, sprinkling holy water, wiping the sweat from your forehead with a damp cloth, one that is clearly not clean. But you do not dare say anything. Because here every act, no matter how useless, is done in the name of God. Prayer is not just a ritual, it is the treatment plan. If you have a fever, they pray for the cooling of your soul. If you are in pain, they pray that you may suffer as Christ suffered on the cross. If you are dying, they begin the requiem before it is strictly necessary. No one panics when a patient stops breathing. In fact, it is seen as a victory. Because in the mindset of the age, healing the body was temporary, saving the soul was eternal. An elderly nun stops beside your bed, placing a gentle yet unsettling hand on your shoulder. "My child, if today were your last day, would you like to confess your sins? You want to say, 'No, I just have a fever.' But in this place there is no such thing as having a fever, only being tested. So they lead you to a small chapel where you sit before a priest. The smell of incense and the stench of the dying blend together like the Chanel perfume of hell. The priest asks, 'My child, do you still keep your faith?' You reply, 'I do, Father, but I would also like to keep my heartbeat.' He smiles. 'Good. Faith is stronger than the heart or lungs. Believe and you shall be saved.' Then he anoints your forehead. The oil is cold, thick, and smells sharp. It is the extreme unction, the final rite given to those near death. The name literally means anointing the soul before it leaves the body. Elsewhere, this would be a funeral. Here it is medical care. If anyone asks, why did hospitals operate like churches, the answer is simple: because sickness was sin. People in the Middle Ages believed illness appeared when one offended God. Therefore, healing could not be separated from repentance. Prayer was the only medicine capable of softening God's anger, and if you died while praying, congratulations, you were healed forever. Occasionally, a patient truly recovered. And you know what people said, a miracle of the Holy Virgin, never the work of the nuns, and certainly not of medicine. Faith was strengthened, and the cycle began anew. Every death proved that the person had been chosen by God. Every recovery proved that God still watched over them. In such a system, no outcome was ever a failure. In the records of St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London around the year 1400, it was clearly written, the hospital was established to help the sick attain salvation. No mention of recovery, no mention of healing, only salvation. Medicine had been rewritten as an appendix to the Bible. And you must admit, in a world that did not yet know about bacteria, prayer was the only weapon that could not be infected. No medicine required, no private rooms, no clean water, only faith, the one resource that was free and could be mass-produced endlessly. The nuns sing hymns, their voices echoing through the stone chamber. The sound is strange, comforting, yet unsettling, like being lulled to sleep at your own funeral. A young woman lies beside you, her breathing thin and shallow. A nun takes her hand and whispers, "Do not be afraid, my child. The Lord is welcoming you home." The woman opens her eyes and murmurs, "But I do not want to go." The nun smiles gently. No one does, but everyone will. The girl exhales one last time. The chapel bell rings soft as a sigh. You watch the scene, and for the first time in your life, you are afraid of being prayed for. In truth, many nuns were genuinely kind, devoted, and selfless to the end. They cared for the sick, carried away the dead, and sang beside the dying, so their souls would not feel alone. They believed that by serving the dying, they were serving God Himself. And sometimes, just sometimes, that truly brought comfort. When all hope was gone, at least someone was there to hold your hand. Even if that hand did not bring medicine, only a blessing for peace. Yet within that beauty lies a quiet tragedy. Prayer could not cure the plague. Faith could not kill bacteria. But they did not know. And in their ignorance, they kept praying, kept believing, kept sending each patient off with love, with mistakes, and with an unshakable conviction that they were doing the right thing. Night falls. Candles flicker. You lie there listening to the nun's gentle prayer drifting through the air. "Lord, bring this soul into your eternal light." You whisper softly, "You may take me, Lord, but could you wait until morning? No one hears you." The prayers continue. You close your eyes, unsure whether you are falling asleep or into the final ritual. And that is the true nature of sacred medicine in the Middle Ages. It did not save people from death, it helped them die peacefully. There was no recovery, only acceptance. No medicine, only forgiveness. No doctors, only God. You live in the modern world with antibiotics, ventilators, and doctors on call 24 hours a day. They do not pray for you, they save you. But have you ever wondered amid the beeping monitors and the steady hum of machines whether there is still room for faith? Yet the greater question is this. If the soul is cared for, who saves the body? The answer, terrifying as it is, will reveal itself when all of Europe steps into the darkest age of medicine, the time of the plague. When hospitals became graveyards and faith became fuel for despair. And if you are still here, if you have survived all 5 circles of this medieval medical hell, congratulations. You have just experienced the most horrifying hospital visit in history, without losing a single drop of blood. But listen, if you think this was terrifying, trust me, the next chapter will make you thankful you were born in this century. With just one click, you will discover why the hospitals of that time were far more terrifying than any battlefield. So do not go anywhere. Hit that subscribe button, because when we continue this journey, you will be the first to be thrown straight into the next nightmare of human history. And if you are curious, or maybe even skeptical, leave a comment. I promise you, the next part will prove one thing beyond doubt. No prayer ever saved anyone, not even you. Hospital or graveyard, the Black Death, and the place where there was no room for the living. The year is 1347. A ship docks at the port of Messina, Sicily. On deck, sailors collapse their bodies, swollen, their skin turning black as if burned. No one knows what they have brought with them. They only know that within months, Europe will fall apart. Its name, the Black Death. And if you think hospitals were meant to save lives, I am sorry, this is when hospitals became the final train station of mankind. Picture the scene: a foggy morning in Paris. The chapel bells toll not for prayer, but to announce the new count of bodies from the night before. Outside the gates of Hôtel Dieu, corpses are stacked in heaps. No beds left. No priests strong enough to perform the rites. No ground left to bury the dead. Even the nuns, the same gentle souls who once held patients' hands in prayer, now lie among the dead themselves. The 14th century was when God, medicine, and humanity all lost control together. The plague spread like a furious spirit. One person coughed, 10 people died. Entire towns were quarantined by setting fire to the houses, the patients, and even the nurses. Yes, in those days, quarantine meant burning. Hospitals, once refuges for the sick, became breeding grounds of death. The stench of rotting flesh was so overwhelming that monks stuffed lavender flowers into their hats just to keep from fainting. But it did not help. Rats crawled everywhere, fleas drank the blood of the dead and leapt onto the living. God could forgive sin, but no one could forgive bacteria. You lie in your bed listening to the screams outside. A mob gathers shouting, "Do not open the doors. They are bringing the plague outside." Patients are now locked inside the hospitals, not for treatment, but to contain the infection. The heavy wooden doors are barred shut. Inside, coughing prayers, moans, and silence. Once those doors close, no one leaves unless they are completely still. The surviving monks are overwhelmed. They anoint hundreds of patients each day. They believe every soul must die in grace. But you just want a sip of clean water. Water gone. Medicine none. God silent. The hospital has now become a laboratory of hell. No more hymns. No more prayers. Only the stench of death. People throw blankets over corpses just to avoid looking at one another. Some patients crawl toward the doors, only to be pushed back with wooden sticks. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Because the Black Death spared no one, not even those trying to save others. Monks anointed the sick with holy oil, then collapsed mid-prayer. No one had the strength to tell who was still human and who was already a corpse. Everything merged into one shapeless mass of despair. In England, in the year 1349, more than half of all medical monks died within a few months. In Florence, the Santa Maria Nuova Hospital turned into a field of bodies. People wrote, the stench of death crept even into the prayers. There was no one left to bury the dead, no one to clean. Even priests began refusing to perform funerals. To die unburied, that was the greatest torment a medieval soul could imagine. And amid the chaos, a new figure emerged, the plague doctors. You have probably seen them: long black coats, bird-like masks, with long beaks, round glass eyes, wooden canes. They looked like cosplayers stepping straight out of a nightmare. But do not laugh, they were the first symbols of modern medicine, and also the most haunting reminder of the terror of that age. The beak of the mask was stuffed with herbs and vinegar. People believed the fragrance would filter out the evil air. In truth, it only kept them from smelling the corpses. The wooden cane was not for helping patients, it was for pushing bodies away. And examining the sick really meant recording the cause of death. Inside hospital walls, areas were divided: a ward for the living, a ward for the dead, and a ward for the soul. But such boundaries meant nothing. Each day, the sick ward turned into the morgue faster than anyone could draw a new map. A young nun, once a gentle singer of lullabies, now sat in a corner laughing softly to herself, hair-tangled, eyes hollow. A guard peered through the doorway and whispered, "In there, the only thing still breathing is death." And then the cruelest thing of all happened. Hospitals were abandoned. No one dared to help. No one brought food. Cities sealed their gates, nailed crosses to the doors, and hung signs reading, "God have mercy on them." Inside, the remaining survivors understood they had been forgotten, and in their final despair, they no longer prayed to live. They prayed to die faster. In the records of Venice from the year 1350, one chilling line was written: "The hospital is no longer a place for healing, but a place where disease ends itself." They no longer called it hospitalium. It had become mortuarium, the house of the dead. The Black Death had turned every holy place into God's crematorium, and everyone believed it was the wrath of the Almighty. So they prayed harder, gathered closer, and spread the plague even faster. All of Europe had become one vast hospital without medicine. In France, physicians advised people to burn the poisoned air with holy fire. In Germany, villagers carried statues of Christ through the streets, and by the end of each procession, the entire village was infected. In England, people wore wooden charms carved with the words, "Lord, protect us," and died within 2 days. And the hospitals, they burned. Many were set ablaze because people believed fire purifies the soul. Ironically, that was the only time medieval hospitals were ever truly disinfected. When the plague finally passed, only ashes and stone pillars remained. The survivors walked through the ruins of the hospitals, gazing at the empty beds, and realized, not everyone who came here seeking salvation wanted to leave alive. Historians would later call it one of humanity's darkest ages. But to those who lived through it, it was simply the will of God. Because when people do not understand the cause, faith becomes the easiest medicine to swallow. If you were a patient in that time, what would you do? Stay and pray, or break down the doors and run carrying the curse with you? That question is not only for them, it is for all of us. When blind faith starts killing, would you dare betray God to live? The medieval hospital died with the Black Death. But its ashes, fear, ignorance, and faith in divine will lingered in the history of medicine for centuries. Every time you walk into a modern hospital, bright, clean, and safe, remember that it stands upon the bones of places like Hôtel Dieu, Santa Maria Nuova, and St. John's. Places where prayer was medicine and medicine was myth. But do not think the medical hell ends here, for when the plague was over, humanity believed it had learned its lesson. In truth, it had merely learned how to trade one kind of death from bacteria for another kind death by the doctor's hand. Escape or die. The survivors and the price of hope. Imagine waking up in a medieval hospital surrounded by corpses, the buzz of flies and prayers echoing through the darkness like whispers from the void. You know perfectly well if you stay here any longer, you will be next. So amid the shadows and the stench of death, you have only 2 choices: escape or wait for God. According to records from the 14th and 15th centuries, out of thousands admitted to hospitals, only a handful ever walked out on their own 2 feet. At the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, the average mortality rate sometimes exceeded 60%. During plague outbreaks, it reached nearly 100, and yet a few souls managed to outlive both death itself and the Church's treatment process. They were not honored. They were not praised. They simply vanished, the inconvenient survivors. One rare case was recorded in the monastery archives of St. John in Bruges, Belgium. In the year 1361, a blacksmith named Willem van der Velde was brought in suffering from fever boils and rotting flesh on his neck. The monks prayed, bled him, and anointed him. Willem nearly died. But then, for reasons no one could explain, he woke up 3 days later. No medicine, no miracle. Perhaps he simply had a stronger body than most. When he opened his eyes, Willem saw that the 5 other patients in his bed were already dead. His first words were, "If this is heaven, then God really needs to tidy up." That night he slipped out of the hospital and fled home. He was branded a man kept alive by the devil. And yes, he lived. But no one celebrated. No one dared touch him. To survive, it seemed, was a sin. Another case from England at St. Mary Bethlehem Hospital, which would later become Bedlam, told of a woman named Agnes who had been treated through prayer and bloodletting, but escaped after 2 days. She was later found living deep in the forest, brewing herbs and wrapping her wounds with moss. She lived another 15 years. When the monks discovered this, they recorded only one note in their ledger: she refused salvation. To survive was to betray God. In those days, leaving the hospital alive was not considered a victory, it was a theological problem. If you recovered without prayer, did that mean God had failed? If you were healed by folk medicine, did that mean the devil had interfered? And so survivors became ghosts in history. No one wrote down their names because their very existence betrayed the system itself. Yet even so, stories of miraculous healing spread quietly, small fragments of hope flickering in the dark. One patient in Florence in the year 1380 was reportedly cured by bathing in wine. Not medicinal wine, drinking wine. They believed alcohol would purify the soul. In reality, it might have killed a few bacteria on his skin, and somehow he recovered. No one knew his name. They only called him Miracolo, the miracle. The entire city came to touch him for blessings. 3 weeks later, he died of exhaustion. Like everything in the Middle Ages, miracles lasted only until God grew bored. According to modern research, such as the 2008 compilation by the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, mortality rates in European hospitals of the time ranged from 30 to 80%, depending on the disease and region. Most patients did not die from their original illness, but from infection exhaustion, or simply being bled too much. In other words, they died from being treated. Those who survived often did so because they escaped early enough. Escaping a hospital back then was not easy. The gates were guarded, the monks watched closely, and worst of all, you were too weak to run. But everyone had their breaking point. Records from the monastery of Saint-Lazare in Marseille described how each night shadows crawled out through the drainage tunnels. One monk wrote they fled salvation as beasts flee the fire. Those who escaped wandered the countryside, shunned by villages. No medicine, no shelter, no help. They did not know whether they were running from the hospital or toward the graveyard. And yet amid that hell, humanity still found a way to live. Folk healers known as cunning women began to appear across Europe. They had no blessing from the church, but they knew how to use honey, garlic, and thyme ingredients that truly had antibacterial properties. They healed wounds, they saved a few lives, and of course they were called witches. Many were burned alive simply because they knew how to wash their hands. That was the moment humanity proved one thing: it would rather die in faith than live by reason. The most haunting question of that time was not, how do we live, but how do we die properly? The monks would say, do not fear death. Fear dying without confession. And the sick, exhausted and trembling, would nod, not because they believed, but because they had no other choice. But could there truly be such a thing as a peaceful death? When you lay surrounded by screams and the stench of decay, could there be any salvation when the person beside you stiffened before anyone had time to cover their face? No. A peaceful death in the Middle Ages was a collective illusion, a ritual of self-hypnosis, where people learned to endure suffering through faith because they had nothing else left to hold on to. If you survived, you did not tell your story. If you died, someone else wrote for you a single line, "Return to God." And that was it. The history of medieval hospitals was not written in data or medicine. It was written in prayers and final breaths. Yet somehow the survivors left traces behind. They passed down remedies, taught others how to brew herbs, and discovered that evil air could sometimes be avoided simply by opening a window. From those tiny fragments of knowledge centuries later, real medicine began to take root. Not in universities, but among those who escaped the hospitals. And perhaps it was they, the ones condemned as traitors to God, who were the first to believe in the right thing. That not every pain is a divine test. That sometimes God does not need you to die to prove your faith. That to live is simply the instinct to keep going. If you had ever lain in a medieval hospital, you would understand dying is not the hard part. The hard part is daring to want to live when the entire world tells you that it is wrong. And so when they walked out of that hell, the survivors did not only defeat disease, they defied religion, destiny, and history itself. They were the first proof that salvation does not come from God, but from the courage of human beings who dare to escape His hand. Echoes from the ashes when God grew tired and science awoke, the 15th century. After hundreds of years of praying, anointing, bleeding, and dying, Europe finally grew tired of death. People began to ask the questions that the Middle Ages had forbidden. If God created mankind, why does He let them rot in His own hospitals? And that single question was enough to ignite the greatest rebellion in the history of medicine. When God grew weary, humanity began to look into its own blood. They dissected bodies, an act once considered the ultimate blasphemy, to learn how the human body truly worked. In Bologna in the year 1315, the physician Mondino de Liuzzi conducted the first public dissection. The entire city came to watch. Some fainted, some prayed, some vomited. But that moment marked the end of God's monopoly over the body replaced by the scalpel. A man dared to open the corpse and declare, "This is not a miracle, this is anatomy." From that day forward, medicine began to smell real blood, not incense. Yet this journey was far from heroic. It began with sacrilege. Those who dared challenge divine authority were branded as heretics. Anatomists had to steal bodies from prisons or dig them out of graveyards after midnight. In the flicker of torchlight, they studied anatomy while praying not to be caught. And in those damp, foul-smelling cellars, modern medicine was born not in churches, but in the dark, where humanity first dared to say no to God. 100 years later came Andreas Vesalius, the man who taught the world to see the human body with new eyes. In 1543, he published De Humani Corporis, Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. The book was filled with illustrations so precise they were almost hauntingly beautiful. People were stunned inside the human body. There were no angels, only tendons, bones, veins, and flesh. The church was furious. But the people were captivated. For the first time, the body was worshipped, not through prayer, but through understanding. At the same time, hospitals themselves began to change shape. From places that healed the soul, they became places that healed the body. The chapel at the center of the ward was replaced by an operating table. The priest was replaced by the physician. Slowly, the word hospital, from the Latin hospitalis, meaning a place of hospitality, took on a new meaning, a place of treatment. Patients were no longer souls to be saved, but bodies to be repaired. It was a quiet revolution, yet one written in blood unfolding within walls once considered sacred. From the 17th to the 18th century, Europe exploded with the spirit of science. People began to boil water, wash their hands, measure their pulse, and count heartbeats. What had been considered blasphemy 300 years earlier had now become medical standard. What was once called bad air miasma was now called germs. But it would take another 500 years before humanity finally understood why people had been dying in hospitals all along, because they were filthy. In 1847, a physician named Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna discovered that mothers were not dying from sin, but from dirty hands. He ordered everyone to wash their hands with a chlorine solution. The result, mortality rates dropped from 18% to 2%. A miracle. No just soap. But the medical establishment laughed in his face and called him the madman of Vienna. Semmelweis died in an asylum, and in one of history's cruelest ironies, his idea was accepted only after his death. From meaningless prayers to soap and microscopes, humanity took 600 years to understand one simple truth: God does not kill. Bacteria do. When you look back, you realize that medical progress was never a steady path. It was a chain of shocks. From every wrong incision, every wrong prayer, every wrong death, humanity learned one right lesson. No science was ever born in light. It was born in the stench of corpses and failure. But the final question still lingers: are we truly any better? You lie in a modern hospital, white lights, machines, beeping doctors moving briskly like robots. You are no longer prayed for. You are monitored. No priest anoints you. A nurse adjusts your IV. You no longer hear Ave Maria, you hear the alarm of a heart monitor. And sometimes in that fragile moment between life and death, you cannot help but wonder, they once died believing in God. Today, I live believing in machines. But what difference does it make when both require faith in something other than myself? The history of hospitals is the history of faith changing form. From faith in the soul to faith in the test tube. From the altar to the operating table. From prayer to laboratory reports. But the essence has never changed. Humanity still fears death and still seeks someone to promise that everything will be all right. If you listen closely, even in the rhythmic hum of a modern ICU, you can still hear the echo of a medieval chapel, that steady hypnotic sound, like a digital prayer. Doctors read numbers as priests once read scripture. Nurses change IVs like offerings at an altar, and you, the patient, still lie there waiting for the final verdict. Perhaps modern medicine is not so different after all. The only real difference is now it has Wi-Fi. But to be fair, we have evolved. Today, hospitals are no longer places where souls are sent back to God, but where humanity is pulled back to the earth. We do not pray to live, we understand to live. And that understanding is what finally burned away the darkness that had lasted for centuries. The ashes of monasteries, the blood-drained bodies, the patients prayed to death, none of it was meaningless. For out of those ashes, medicine grew like a stubborn weed, needing no miracle, only a question. A question that for centuries no one dared to ask: if my soul has been cared for, then who will save my body? And so the wheel of history turned. God stepped back. Science stepped forward. Yet somewhere within the hum of ventilators and the alarm of critical monitors, you can still hear the echo of the past. Their nurses did not give medicine, they gave prayers. Only now those prayers have a new name. Please let the machine stay on. The medieval hospital was never a place of healing. It was where humanity learned to look death in the eye and not turn away. And if there is one lesson from that hell, it is this: progress never comes from faith. It comes from those who dare to doubt. If you had entered a hospital in the year 1300, your best chance of leaving would have been as ashes. But it was from those ashes that the first light of medicine began to shine. So the next time you find yourself in a hospital, do not thank only your doctors. Thank the countless souls who once died praying instead of healing. Because of them, you now live and can be grateful that today, humanity no longer treats the soul before treating the body. And with that, you have survived 8 chapters of the nightmare called medieval medicine. If you are still here, congratulations, you are officially tougher than 90% of the patients in the year 1300, but do not leave just yet. Because behind history, there are still countless other tales, insane, horrifying, and darkly hilarious, waiting for you. All just one click away. Subscribe not because I need the numbers, but because you need to know how stupid, filthy, and absurd humanity had to be to survive. And if you have thoughts, doubts, or questions, leave a comment. Who knows, your question might just become the next chapter I tell. Now rest, survivor. We will meet again in the next nightmare.